To my left is President Noel Latif, President of the American Foreign Policy Association, the oldest association of its kind in our country. It will celebrate its 100th anniversary in 6 years. Noel works at trying to more broadly educate the public in our country about the foreign policy challenges that confront it each year, and he's devised a number of ways to do that reach out to universities, the general public. They work with, FPA works with the World Affairs Councils across the country. They each year publish the Great Decisions Handbook, which engages, what do you think?
400,000.
400,000 people. That is, I think, an invaluable outreach in our country. They're now thinking about moving down, actually moving down into high schools and into junior high schools. The thought being that, you know, the earlier that we get people thinking about this, the better. So Noel is on the panel. At the extreme left is Rick Ruth. Rick Ruth is a Foreign Service officer who has been in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs since it started. No, not since it started, but for a long time. So look, Rick has had a real long view at how this Bureau, which he and I think Dan Whitman agrees, and probably other people in the room, does the finest work as far as public diplomacy is concerned. That the educational and cultural piece of this is the real hardcore, whatever you will, of this. I will say just a few things and then keep quiet. Just in view from the field, I was on a panel at Harvard University about 5 years ago with a retired Foreign Service colleague named Dick Miles, who had been ambassador to Georgia. And the students, the Harvard students, wanted to know what he was doing during the Velvet Revolution, because he was ambassador to Georgia when that was going on. And their questions seemed to be, they wanted to know, you know, what were you actually doing? I think the students thought that he was standing at the window above in his office, looking out over the crowd with a walkie-talkie telling the students and the revolutionaries, no, move down that street, you know. That's not quite how it goes. And he answered that he wasn't actually directing things that day, but that the people who were doing that day, many of them had come to the United States on the Muskie program 12 years earlier. And that the most important thing he thought, this is Dick Miles now, after having been Deputy Chief of Mission in Moscow, Ambassador in Georgia, Ambassador in, I think, Azerbaijan, and one more embassy I'm not remembering now. At the end of a Foreign Service career, the most important thing we did was those educational and cultural exchange programs. That's what Dick Miles said after he retired to that Harvard audience. I wish he had said it while he was ambassador in some of those places, you know, because that's not the way it boiled down. So here we have, and I've seen this phenomenon quite a bit, people thinking at the end of their career, that was the most important thing, but while it's actually going on, well, you know, that we have other priorities because we need to, quote unquote, promulgate foreign relations. So that's sort of one view from the field I would offer up. University linkages and partnerships are tremendously important, and they're not well attended to now. I would just mention Ms. Thompson and I began working on a university linkage and partnership between the SUNY system and a series of campuses in Turkey. We began working on it. We got that award in the spring of 2001. in the fall of 2001, September 11 happened. And here we were, you know, everybody has the impression that New York is a very sophisticated place, and boy, we really are very sophisticated New Yorkers. But let me tell you, a lot of people were saying, you're going to be working in Turkey? What? Are you crazy? You're going to be working with Muslim people? And it was nice to have that award because we could say, George Bush told us to do this. So I would just say, for those, one of the thoughts in this is that there are very positive ways that the government can help universities. In this case, we were getting some cover for working in a place that we certainly should have been working in, but that was being criticized now. And the help, that award was very important for us. So university linkages, you know, are really something that I think there should be more attention paid to it. I guess all I would say is that the universities play a major role, and each of the countries that I served in played a major role in what we were able to do, and that role was, generally speaking, on the high road. I just say this, and this is a true story. We have a new ambassador in Egypt. She was confirmed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In her confirmation hearings, she assured the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that we were working with 46 non-governmental organizations as Egypt makes its transition to democracy. And the Senate liked that. And then she got out to Cairo, and she got ready to present her credentials. And the Egyptians said, whoa, wait a minute, we're not sure we're ready for that just yet. That's a stunning thing. That's an unexpected thing. And what the Egyptians wanted to know was the name, address, telephone number, pulse rate, and blood pressure of the people running those 46 non-governmental organizations that are helping Egypt make its transition to democracy. What I'm saying is that we have to be somewhat more subtle, I think, about, I don't know if we can do that much longer in places. Maybe we can do it in Florida, help them make transitions to democracy. But there's a lot of, now you will have seen that the Egyptians actually locked up, or didn't lock up, but charged, I think, 19 people who were involved in that, including the son of the current Secretary of Transportation. That was resolved 2 days ago. The Egyptians said, no, you need to post $300,000 bail, and then you can go. And so that happened, and those people have gone. Believe it or not, that's a good thing, that the Egyptians decided to diffuse that way. We can maybe take the bail out of the tear gas canister fund that we supplied to the Egyptian military. What I'm suggesting is, were we to now say in a place like Egypt, we want to put the education of our young people, your young people and our young people on a higher plane, we want this to be more prominent, that would be, I think, warmly welcomed in a place like Egypt. I think there is broad support still around the world for this kind of activity, and I hope we're going to get to a point where we are able to do this. I want to stop and turn to Noel.
Well, thank you, Bob. I want to compliment the organizers of this conference. I got on Amtrak this morning from New York, and there's an in-house publication called Arrive sitting on your seat, and it's got Bill Clinton endorsing the power of education. I don't know if this was something you arranged, but you should take credit for it. President Bill Clinton leads the way to higher learning, problem solving, and greater opportunities in an ever-changing world. A few days ago, we held our annual financial services dinner, and I know Ambassador Gasende was with us. And one of the honorees was a gentleman by the name of Yngve Slinslat, the president of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And just before dinner, I asked him how he felt about the outlook for the U.S. economy and what percentage of this sovereign wealth fund's assets, the largest in the world with some $600 billion, is allocated to the United States. And Mr. Slinstat surprised me. He began by saying that as a young man growing up in Oslo, he had always aspired to come to this country for a college education. And he applied to the University of California at Santa Barbara, was accepted, and was not terribly well organized in getting himself together to come to the States, arrived at LAX and was asked by the immigration officer where was his student visa, and he replied that he didn't have one. The immigration officer told him, "Welcome to the United States." And this is a man who now controls $600 billion, and the happy ending to this is that $200 billion of that, fully a third, is invested in this country. A couple of years ago, I came across an article in the Chronicle for Higher Education about India's overburdened higher education system. My filing isn't too bad because I found the article from the January 10, 2010 Chronicle in my papers over the weekend. And the paragraph that caught my attention reads, "Some 220 million Indian children are enrolled in elementary and secondary schools, but its 400 universities can accommodate fewer than 10 million students, just 12% of the college-age population. At the same time, the country's education minister is pressing to increase the college-going rate to 30% within the next 10 years, but efforts to expand capacity are moving slowly." The question that loomed in my mind when I first read it is, how transformative would a significantly higher college-going rate be for India's economy? Or would it be destabilizing if employment opportunities couldn't keep apace? I believe we need to shed more light on the role of institutions of higher learning in the context of the global economic development agenda. USAID over the years has made grants to universities in developing countries. The Carnegie Corporation of New York has made a significant investment in higher education in Africa, particularly in South Africa in recent years. Is there a role for the proposed collaborative, I guess it is a collaborative at this point, in evaluating the effectiveness of these investments and in making policy recommendations? The collaborative could serve as a clearinghouse for best practices and for innovation in education. The interface between technology and education is compelling and was referred to earlier in the day. Is distance learning an answer to India's low college-going rate? Or is bricks and mortar preferable with more satellite campuses sprouting around the world? And what about the impact of academic exchanges? The current issue of the Foreign Service Journal includes this letter from Ambassador David Schwartz, whose last posting was as ambassador to Belarus, U.S. ambassador to Belarus. Of the fascinating articles in the December journal pertaining to the breakup of the Soviet Union, I found the most instructive one to be Yale Richmond's Cultural Diplomacy in the Cold War. In it, Richmond concludes that the 30 preceding years of U.S.-Soviet academic and cultural exchanges proved vital in bringing an end to the Soviet Union. Particularly noteworthy is his quote from Oleg Kahugin, former KGB officer and head of Soviet counterintelligence, who said that, quote, exchanges played a tremendous role in the erosion of the Soviet system. As Richmond points out, Kalugin was among the first group of Soviet academic exchangees to the United States, arriving in 1958. Having served in Soviet-era Moscow and Warsaw and in post-Soviet Minsk, the ambassador says, I had ample opportunity to observe the effects of such exchanges. Richmond is completely correct in his conclusions, but I would go one step further. Academic and cultural exchanges demonstrated the superiority of strategic policies over tactical ones. I could also see the collaborative in the advocacy business. We should do everything in our power to continue to make the United States a magnet for the best students from around the world. I began with the reference to Mr. Slinstadt, and I remember when I was at the State Department compiling examples of mutual benefits from foreign assistance projects for a report that was circulated on the Hill. It basically brought together examples of where projects in research and development had benefited the United States as well as the recipients of those countries. Would a collection of personal narratives from influential individuals from around the world who studied in the US be a worthwhile undertaking? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Noel. Rick is probably going to say it, but a lot of us learned an awful lot from Yale Richmond.
Indeed we did. Indeed we did.
Rick, please.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to be here and have a few minutes of your time. I'm not going to take up too many of them, I hope, but perhaps throw a few things out. Maybe I can find a few places where I can make a comment that hasn't been made yet, because the panels so far have been excellent, and I certainly applaud Bob and everyone else here who's put this together in bringing people from different perspectives together, as they said was their purpose, and they've successfully done it. And it's been very helpful to me to have light shined on this topic from a variety of different angles. I also have to confess, as so many have straight up, that I'm a beneficiary of U.S. government programs in area studies and languages. I was a Russian major. My first real job in the world was with the United States Information Agency as a Russian-speaking exhibit guide traveling around the former Soviet Union. Then I spent roughly 20 years as Mark Johnson did, a specialist in the Soviet Union. I remember very clearly a very, very happy day in my life when I could look at my work requirements. Every federal employee is required to have annual work requirements that says what they're going to do for the next year. I was able to take my pen and cross off "Destroy Evil Empire" because after several decades of hard work, I had succeeded and was able to move on to some other things. As befits a panel called The View from the Field, I'm going to speak as a practitioner. I have no thesis to give you, just a number of comments that I think might be useful. But being a practitioner doesn't mean, or any practitioner, of course, we all hope that we're not blind to the major currents or trends of our times, the context in which we operate. We want to be thoughtful practitioners, and while recognizing that we're just, from a Tolstoyan perspective, we're just molecules in a historic wave sweeping us along. So let's try and do good things while history is moving us forward. The first thing I want to mention is that in terms of practical foreign policy, practical public diplomacy. The role of higher education is here. Which forms it may take in the future, which directions it will be funded, how it will be reflected as we go forward, of course, is a topic of this conversation and many conversations. But in a day-to-day, real-world perspective, the power and the influence and the importance of higher education is recognized. And I will just give you a couple of examples. These are not names that lightly trip off the tongue, but since the election of President Obama and the appointment of Secretary Clinton as Secretary of State, we have had the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission, the U.S.-Indonesia Comprehensive Partnership on Education, the U.S.-China High-Level Dialogue on People-to-People Exchanges, the U.S.-Iraq Strategic Framework, the U.S.-India-Obama Sing 21st Century Knowledge Initiative. We have Brazil's President, Dilma Rousseff, who, by the way, is a ECA alumna, has begun a program called Science Without Borders to send 75,000 Brazilian college students abroad, fully half of them to the United States, according to the plan. And the point here is that there is no major bilateral foreign policy initiative of this administration that does not include a significant higher education component. Some of them also have cultural and professional and other related exchanges that this Bureau operates, but it's primarily focused on higher education. And every one of those groups has a senior level led committee, joint committee, that pursues higher education issues between those countries. With Indonesia, for example, just the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs has a 5-year, $3 million a year commitment to facilitate and conduct academic exchanges with Indonesia. We also have the issue of historic opportunity, which presents itself in a variety of ways. For example, take today's headlines, the Arab Awakening. When countries move or attempt to move with fits and starts towards democracy, and we all know that that's not easily done, whether it's the kind of case that Bob just mentioned with Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, other countries that we can look at. When new leadership comes to the fore, among the things they always ask for, of course they want economic aid, of course they're interested in military aid, of course they're interested in a variety of things, but right up in the top 4 or 5 things that new leadership always requests is greater engagement, more linkages with higher education in the United States. Right from the start, we want to send our students to America. We want your professors coming to our country. We want your premier institutions and our institutions to link up with each other. It seems like it ought not be a surprise to foreign policymakers that always is high up on another country's request list. It's no surprise to those of us here, but in fact it often seems to take us by surprise. And we don't prepare for it as well as we should. We don't set the funding aside for it in advance as we might, but nonetheless, it's one of those issues that repeatedly indicates the very high regard which foreign countries have for investment in their own country, in their own society, in their young people, and the role that the United States can play in that regard. Also, frontline states, as was mentioned earlier in the day, needless to say, when Uncle Sam is interested in solving a foreign policy problem or sees a foreign policy challenge, Uncle Sam likes to throw money at it. That often means more study in critical languages, more area studies, more higher education programs. As long as they come with no inappropriate strings, that's not a bad thing. That's the kind of program that got me into Russian studies. And so for Pakistan is one of the world's largest Fulbright programs now. It's entirely one way, regrettably, because the security situation is such in Pakistan that we really cannot send American Fulbrighters to Pakistan. But we have had, from USAID for the last 5 consecutive years, $20 million a year transferred to ECA simply to conduct Fulbright programs for Pakistanis to come to the United States. Iraq has one of the larger Fulbright programs in the Near East region also because of special funding for Iraq. These kinds of things, again, highly targeted, obviously driven by a foreign policy concern, but very good things indeed. Would that we could have them for the whole world? never going to happen. But as long as it's important where it's happening, and as long as they're done under what I would call the Fulbright-Hays mandate, so that they are nonpartisan, that they are academically rigorous, that they are fully based on merit and have no strings attached to them, then these are excellent opportunities. When the time comes, I don't know when and how we'll sort of reconnect with North Korea, or connect with North Korea, we've never been connected with them, how we'll reconnect with Cuba or other countries where we have no diplomatic relations or very strained diplomatic relations. What I can tell you is that the very first thing that takes place, as Mike McCary indicated earlier in some of his remarks, the first thing to take place will be a public diplomacy program. It will be an exchange program. It may be film, it may be sports, it may be higher education, but it will be one of our programs. Several years back, when there was a brief flurry of excitement about Libya doing away with its nuclear program, the first thing that the United States government and the government of Libya did was have a bilateral exchange of education officials and university rectors. That's the kind of program that we can predict when the political time is right for those countries. Another important point is, I would say, standing behind all of these specific things, specific bilateral agreements, specific diplomatic opportunities, is simply, and it's not simple, but simply the overwhelming attractiveness, in the neutral sense of the word, the attractiveness of the United States education system. Every public affairs officer in the world, as university professors and administrators as well, every PAO wakes up every morning to a world of unlimited challenges and opportunities and very limited and constrained resources. And that PAO has to decide, what am I going to do today? I have this much money, I have this kind of staff, I have these facilities, whatever the assets are. What am I going to do to make a good thing happen? And the fact that universally, the United States education system is recognized by most as the premier system in the world is a tide that lifts the PAO in all of his or her activities. Even if there's no specific program, very often there are, but even without that, the awareness, the receptivity, the respect, the interest in the American education system is a very important day-to-day influence in the conduct of public diplomacy in the field. And it's not, I mean, it is the quality of the American higher education system, but it is also, very importantly, its openness, its flexibility, and what I call its forgiving nature, okay? If you decide to go to college in the United States, at whatever level, at whatever degree of income, at whatever kind of institution, and you flame out in your freshman year, you can come back. You can reapply again a year later, work, join the military, come back, go to 5 different colleges, keep dropping out, keep failing, keep coming back. There's no end. At no point does the American education system say, sorry to you or you or you, we're done with you. We've given up on you. You can't learn anymore, okay? There are many countries in the world where that is not the case, where it is not an open or flexible system. It is not a forgiving system. You have to compete at a certain level in national exams. You make it or you don't make it. If you don't make it in many of those countries, you are done, okay, for your life. So if you're a late bloomer, sorry, you're not going to be a doctor or a lawyer. The fact that we have this kind of system that recognizes, if you will, human frailty and the different paths we all take through life and continues to offer that opportunity is a hugely attractive and often underrated aspect of the American education system. I would also, with that in mind, I want to say that just as an individual and a professional in this field, I am very skeptical of grand plans to marshal or focus or point higher education at something, at a goal, at a task, or to make it the tool or instrument of something. Education is so vast, so protean in its nature, so differing in what we all think it is supposed to be from from the one far extreme was it's vocational training. I just want to get that job, and I just want college to give me the skills to get it, and I'm going to make a lot of money, all the way to somebody who says, I just want to figure out my journey through life and everything in between. And to the extent we try and limit, narrow, define, like I said, marshal that to a purpose, doesn't mean that's necessarily a bad thing, but we have to keep in mind that we don't want to inadvertently squander something even greater and more fundamental while we do that. And so I'm going to end up with a quote. Everybody likes quotes. I love quotes. That gives you a sense of what I mean about the importance of these programs independent of any particular focus. This comes from a Fulbrighter. And I was delighted to notice, I guess there has barely been 30 minutes go by today where somebody didn't say, oh, and I was a Fulbrighter, okay? This is a citizen of the UK, Deborah Christie, medical doctor, neuropsychologist, who said, looking back, but without polling other Fulbrighters, I suspect we all felt one identical thing, the great beating heart of that marvelous and terrifying beast, America. 8 years later, I can well feel that heart beat, and it is always there to remind me that the person who came home to Britain was not the person who went. Okay? Thank you.
Thanks. Why don't we take just a few minutes for some questions, and then we're maybe 15 minutes behind, but we can be a little longer behind maybe. So if you have questions, please. Daniel?
Do we want to discuss measurement and evaluation? Is it something we have to deal with?
I'll tell you what, I mean, it's a great question, Dan. I headed up the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs evaluation unit and for 10 years, and also the public diplomacy evaluation unit briefly. And by and large, it makes people's eyes glaze over when you talk about it. But what I will say is that, in fact, we have been measuring exchanges. Public diplomacy writ large is a more difficult task. But with exchanges, we have been measuring it for a decade. We have a lot of studies. The FLEX study was mentioned. There are many others. We do have a standard set of metrics that we use in evaluating the impact, short and medium and long term, of exchanges. I would like to say the reason we've been able to do it at ECA when others have not is because of our towering moral and intellectual stature. But in fact, we have a dirty little secret, and that is it's easier to do exchanges than many other types of public diplomacy, because we can take a cohort of Turkish students who come to SUNY Albany. We have their name, I mean, we don't, but I mean, we could have their names, addresses, emails, and we could follow them year in and year out, and we can ask them, what did this mean to you? How did it affect your life? How did it affect your career? Your opinions on various topics. And we can ask them a year later, 5 years later, and 10 years later. Not long ago, we did a retrospective on Fulbright that went back 25 years. We can do that with exchanges because we know the population we're talking about, and we can show in quantitative terms the very powerful and enduring impact of exchanges. It's much harder to do with many other kinds of public diplomacy programs because the audience is sort of harder to pin down and harder to track and come up with those kind of quantitative evidences in addition to the qualitative, the anecdotal, which is also extremely important. But, you know, I mean, it's a subject I'm interested in talking about. If somebody here down the line is very keen on it, let me know, and I can happy to talk about it individually. But that's probably enough for now. Yeah.
John, I think you.
I was actually going to ask the evaluation question.
Ah.
Okay.
Sally?
Yeah. I was sort of thinking about bringing this up, but you did first, Rick. And you did it in a way that I just want to probe a little bit further. You brought up Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, and the Brazilian 101,000 and growing strong initiative. funded with, well, 75,000 of the scholarships were launched and funded by the Brazilian government with the invitation to the private sector to fund additional scholarships. The private sector had, at last count a week ago, funded 26,000, but with many more coming in. This truly is 100,000 strong. And frankly, when I hear the Brazilians speak about it, I feel quite humbled by this bold move that their government has made in such a short span of time, to put this out there, launch it, and fund it all so quickly. And we have done similar things where we've made pronouncements, but when we scratch the surface, there's not funding behind those. And even though the Brazilian government wasn't funding all of this, they made a bold enough statement in funding a significant portion of this that they demonstrated real leadership, I thought. And I'm just saying that because I would like to hear whether other people sort of felt similarly humbled by that or had anything to say about that.
I mean, I think it's marvelous. It's patterned on what was initially done between the United States and China when our Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs announced a 100,000 strong initiative to have Americans studying in China. It's a catchy term, 100,000 strong, and a number of other countries have picked up on that. Their primary interest tends to be that 100,000 strong coming to the United States. Our interest tends to be both directions. We want their young people coming here. We want to be the destination of choice, as is I think the buzz phrase now for those students. We also want our young students to go abroad so they learn the skills they need to live in a globalized world. And so again, I'm impressed with what Brazil has done also, but I don't know, did you have a question?
Well, what is the funding behind our 100,000 strong?
Not much.
That's my
These things
question.
tend to be cobbled together out of, and what we often call in the bureaucracy, reflagging. In other words, you take everything that SUNY's doing, you take everything that Vanderbilt is doing, you take everything we're already doing, you add them all up, see where you are, and try and make up enough difference to get you to a number that people think sounds impressive. You know, I wish it were otherwise, but the large amounts of funding are not there unless they happen often serendipitously. Again, they happen if there's a foreign policy initiative. One can declare a foreign policy need in a lot of places, but it really has to be something that focuses the attention of the White House and Congress, or both. Or there's an individual, as happens, as Bob and others have related. There are individuals who rise above their time in academia to make things happen. Happens in Congress as well, that you'll find a particular individual who will drive funding towards a very worthy program. If you look at ECA's budget, look at the names, Fulbright, Muskie, Humphrey, Gilman. Members of Congress like to name these programs after themselves, but as Bob indicated, they often do it late in their careers, like ambassadors who look back, and say, the greatest thing I ever did, the best thing we ever did was Fulbright exchanges. By the way, President Saakashvili of Georgia is also one of our alumni. I can't resist telling you that more than 340 of our exchange participants have gone on to be the head of state or government in their country. More than 50 have gone on to be Nobel laureates. So it's a great alumni crowd that a lot of you are in, and all of you can take pride in. But big money's not there. So we want to keep everything. We want to keep things going. We want to be opportunistic. We fight for resources every day, but I'd be misleading you if I thought that we were getting close to the end of the rainbow and close to finding a pot of gold.
Nick?
Thanks. As we've been talking today, one of the things that keeps coming to mind is what was touched on, the problem of the Said Qutb syndrome. How do you avoid somebody coming to your country, especially in a program where there are large numbers of people coming in and they can't be looked after individually? How do you avoid that person having a negative experience? And it only takes one or two to have a negative experience for it to be a major problem. We could talk about those students who went to Hamburg, who were presumably counted as a plus in German public diplomacy, but then went on to become the 9/11 hijackers, or the young Japanese man from the University of Oregon who went on to become the Japanese foreign minister who signed the pact with Hitler. And authorized an attack on Pearl Harbor because he knew who the Americans were, he knew what they thought of Japanese people, and had it from his direct experience. I think that we need to, one thing on our agenda has to be, how do we upgrade our campus services to make sure that we are really reaching out to students and that the campus delivery, the sharp end of exchange, is fit for purpose? And Mike and I were in Australia, was it a year and a half ago now, Mike? And in Australia, they had this thing of thinking about international education as being like an industry. And in fact, in the state of Victoria, it is their largest industry, only because Victoria has nothing worth digging up and selling, unlike other Australian states who have mining as their biggest industries. But it's either number 2 or number 1 in everywhere you go in Australia. But their problem was that industry wasn't just the metaphor for international education, it was the organizing principle. And people were coming in on a production line and getting very, very negative experiences, and were getting caught up in street violence, anti-student violence, and a few Australian campuses were starting to talk about this, but they were talking with an honesty about these problems that we don't see yet on American campuses. And I had the experience with me. Fulbright rejected me, so I came as a Harkness fellow to Princeton. And there, the first thing that I did on campus was all the British got together, and it was like an escape committee in one of those prisoner of war movies, where we're all sitting together thinking about being British. You turn inwards on yourself and become a sort of a lowest common denominator version of your home identity. And maybe that's not a problem for British people, but when it's happening for people whose cultures include extremist positions, this can be disastrous. So I wonder if we can talk about how do we share best practices, how do we evaluate best practices and find a way beyond Said Qutb and beyond the people getting the wrong messages from international educational exchange.
Nick brings up
I've got one more question here, if you don't mind, Bob. Just get a couple on the floor before you guys wrap up.
Just as far as thinking about, I think that's a fantastically important question. And if we're thinking about this as a research agenda, a more kind of holistic understanding of this, not just the success stories, which are incredibly important, but those who didn't have a good time. And Qutb is one of the most obvious examples, but there are many, many others. Students who feel alienated, who don't feel the services are provided, who fail in their degree programs. And frankly, we do a poor job of that. As important, I think Rick Roof's point about the new kind of bilateral architecture of this is incredibly important. And yet, that still does not address the question of capacity at our universities and how we handle the students coming in. And it's so ad hoc and frankly so poorly organized in many cases that that's the other side of the story. And of course, those are exactly the people who stay away from alumni networks. They don't respond to surveys coming from ECA or anybody else. There's that whole other hidden part of it. And if we really are thinking of this as a more comprehensive research agenda, we need to try to figure out how to add that piece as well.
To follow on what both of you guys are saying, again, as Director of International Student Services on a campus with 5,000 international students out of 50,000 total student population, this is a huge challenge because oftentimes our office of 15 people is seen as, well, y'all are the international people. So what I get are the phone calls from professors saying, my research assistant smells bad. What do I do? Or from campus police saying, we got called because there is somebody praying in a public space in one of our buildings, and they're clearly Muslim, so they're probably a terrorist. So it's, when we talk about an agenda, I think one of the things that we run into, and certainly our university does, we get them in the door, and then we do nothing with them. And I think that was kind of some of Nick's point. Take the money. I mean, so, and there's a very interesting division, at least on our campus, between the academic services, that is admissions, registrar, student business services, scholarships, financial aid, even ISS, because we do mostly compliance and regulatory management of our programs on campus, and student affairs. And again, if you think about our population, it's 10% international. The other 90% is domestic students. So those student affairs folks are not focused at all on trying to integrate our international students into our population. So again, you know, the ones on exchange visitor programs where there are requirements for orientation, there are requirements for interaction with our J visitors, even those, they stop after like the first few months. Again, those of you who've been on them would know better than I do, but it's left to student services people whose background really is on the financial and the logistics of everything. So again, I don't know how you get that on an agenda to help educate faculty and staff to integrate the international students onto campus when we talk about comprehensive internationalization on campus.
Yeah, I think just quickly to add on to that, one of the ideas that I've seen recently is really the emergence of international students as a vulnerable population. It's easy to take advantage of them. And one of the glaring examples of this is Dickinson State University in North Dakota. Recently, there was an audit that came out commenting on the fact that they had turned into a diploma mill for Asian students, that essentially they were accepting them, they were giving them a degree, but they weren't requiring them to actually do the work that was necessary. They were taking the money and then sending them back home.
Or, and the other one is in contrast, again, we have lots of graduate students, they're brought in funded on graduate assistantships, research assistantships. They're technically supposed to be working 20 hours per work week. They get paid $1,000 a month for a half-time appointment. And they're in their labs 24/7. I mean, literally, I have found students camped out on cots in their labs. And when you confront the professors, which of course, by the way, as a staff member, you don't confront professors. When you confront professors about that, not only the violating labor law and violating immigration law and violating every single ethical principle you might possibly have, the answer is, oh, well, they spend 20 hours a week working on the research that they get paid for, and those other 80 hours, they're working on their own research in my lab. So, you know, what do you do about that? And again, they're being exploited.
So why don't we turn it back to the panel for some concluding comments and wrap up.
Jason, I would just, this is a phenomenal discussion because there are mechanisms and there are people were you having a hard time hearing me?
It's going to take Bob.
Who are skilled at dealing with international student support services. It is appalling to me to hear, you know, some of the comments about this. This is, Jay, where are you? All right. You know, Buffalo has the most admirable statistics of any public university in America in terms of how many international students they have. I think you're, what, 11th or 12th, and the other top 10 or 11 are private institutions. Believe me, Buffalo spends a lot of time worrying about, being concerned about what's going on with those students. Okay? And any institution today that is taking international students in and not worrying about student support services is irresponsible. There's no other way to describe that. That is highly irresponsible. There are standards for this. Michael and I, you know, worked in the past a lot with NAFSA. There are all kinds of standards for it, practices. There's no reason for this kind of ignorance whatsoever at all. The other thing that scares me is that I remember being involved in a discussion, Nick, about the influx of Muslim students going to remote campuses in America, okay, when that phenomenon was starting. and speaking with members of Congress from those states, worrying about what was going to happen to groups of Muslim students at remotely located, obscure campuses. We were really concerned about this. Does the federal government have a mechanism to be able to deal with that? Not really, okay? But it's not as if this was an unrecognized phenomenon. But if you're taking international students, you know, if you are profiting from them, and most of the time, you know, we're making money by the hosting of international students, there's a responsibility there. You must have student counselors. You must have a hotline. You must be able to help them. You know, we have a number of strains going on in our country these days. We have ICE officers riding buses across upper New York State, collaring people who look different. Wow, you know, we used to tell international students, don't carry all your documents with you. We don't want you to lose them. So don't carry your passport, don't carry your I-20. Now we tell them, you better carry everything. Because if that ICE guy gets you on a bus because you look different, you know, we may not hear for 48 hours that you're gone, okay? Because you're popped into some detention facility because you didn't have your passport and your I-20. So this is an urgent problem. You know, we're not talking about USC's neighborhood down by the Mexican border. We're talking about by the Canadian border, you know, where, and we have all kinds of funny people on our buses. They look different. Anyway, I suspect we've got to stop.
We're about there, unless there are a couple of just short concluding comments from Noel or Rick.
I just remember when I was at Princeton that there was a very engaging dean of international affairs or international student affairs, and she took a great interest in.
Joy Montero.
No, this was a lady who was married to a professor in the Near Eastern Studies department.
Oh, yeah.
And she was like she really took her job very seriously.
Oh, I'm good.
You good? All right. Great. Well, let's thank the panelists.